Hey there, my name is Michael Finney. Thank you for tuning in again. This audio series is an exploration of the Nobel-winning mathematician John Nash through the perspective of Jal, who goes by the handle Socrapatoshi on Twitter. Why do these realizations matter?
Since Bitcoin's inception, it was sort of taken a hold of by a libertarian faction. I think for a lot of people, Bitcoin is that thing that we wish existed. And so it does that thing we want, to happen. And for some people, they're waiting for a massive change in the world. And for some of those people, they want the elite and the governments to sort of die. For a lot of the early Bitcoin adopters, the fact or seeming fact that a government can't take Bitcoin down once it's reached a certain level, there's just no stopping it, became the model, the call for the new order of anarchy. And with that came a lot of what's called Austrian-minded economic philosophers who believe that, and I don't know how far I can really get into this or need to, but they believe that a money should be back 1-to-1. So like they want to be back on the gold standard, and I think or guess it means they don't want credit, and I really don't think it's worth opening that up. But nonetheless, they built an argument that Bitcoin is going to be the global currency, and it's going to push all other major currencies to have no purchasing power at all. So it's going to hyperinflate them, and this is dubbed hyper-Bitcoinization. And so I've known about Bitcoin for, 6 years or so. And that movement, that libertarian movement, carried it. And then eventually you had academia and then central bank researchers, etc., come and try and do studies on Bitcoin. And every time they do a study, they come to the idea that Bitcoin can't scale in that regard. And it's not useful because you can't increase or decrease the supply of money. So you can't adjust the supply of Bitcoin to the demand. Therefore, there's no mechanism for stabilizing the purchasing power. Now, this happened on and around the time when persons, most notably including Roger Ver, and a faction arose that wanted to increase the block size. And the idea was Bitcoin can't scale on the base layer unless the block size was raised, and that was in opposition to what they call, and we could call, core and core supporters, who are basically saying, if sort of two things. One, if you just increase the block size, the economics doesn't necessarily hold, and you basically open an attack vector. You basically, it's like you're breaking it. And I think along with that, the idea is, some people say, well, we could have a one-off raise, or we could raise every X years. But I think a lot of people, luckily, realize that you're opening it up to political debate, and you're taking the apolitical nature out of the money. And with Bitcoin as a basis for John Nash's argument, it doesn't need to scale. It can just stay, especially the base layer can stay as a high value settlement layer. And so nations can use it to transact, because the fact that it only can do, say, 7 transactions per second, that could be an old number, things have changed, but just for example, it doesn't preclude it. Like, it makes it really expensive for the average Joe user, but it doesn't preclude it from large, like you could still send $1 billion for $5, say that, there's no problems there. That sort of battle, it was known as a civil war in Bitcoin land, say. It really shaped the narrative, and you had both sides fighting around how Bitcoin would scale, and how it would scale in regard to becoming a world currency. And Nick Szabo put out an interesting essay around that time. I think almost too late. I think it's really useful. I think it's called Blockchains and Social Scalability. It's something like that. And in it, he says Satoshi's brilliant contribution was, it says something like that. And it was the trade-off between computational scalability for social scalability. And what's often cited is, in the beginning, Bitcoin didn't have a block size cap, as I understand, and then it was found that you could do some sort of attack on it, like a DDoS attack or something like that. So they decided to put a 1 megabyte cap on it. And if you look on the forum, the next few posts after Satoshi said, "Oh, we put this cap on, don't worry, we can raise it if we need to," more than one poster said, we can't do this, we need to remove this now because it's going to get harder to change as time goes by. And I don't think Satoshi responded to that. So sort of possible, or it seems like the idea was there was an attack vector. They decided they had to put this cap on, and then sort of anyone who had a decent understanding of it was like, we can't remove this. And so fast forward to the future now, and there's been a runaway with the narrative of it, and it's like it's sort of too late. But there hasn't been a narrative or an explanation or an argument as to how Bitcoin can survive without, how can grow to be a global currency without raising that block size. Now, since then, we've had Lightning channels and we have layer 2 scaling, which is very interesting. It seems to have its own limitations. I don't look at it as like broken. I think it's definitely part of the evolution of it. But if you go there, the world has not considered, and I try and read any paper I can from any of the central banks, especially that put papers on the subject. It hasn't considered that Bitcoin could be used as a global inflation target. So that the Nashian orientation hasn't been considered.
How does it affect the world we live in?
So Nash talks about how there could be an initial groundswell. He uses the word, and it has some different meanings, and I don't perfectly recall them. I know that I looked it up and I contemplated it. But the idea is sort of after an initial confusion, after an initial, like there's a lot of change that he foresees, and we've gone through a lot of change for people. Say, for example, if you're using Bitcoin as an example, there's been a lot of change in our understanding of money because of that. And he says then after a certain period of time, the orientation might start to change. And then he starts to describe it, and he starts to describe how an international money might arise, and it might have like a decent quality in what he calls the Gresham sense, which it's another thing I probably won't go too far into. Many people know it, but the idea is there's good money and bad money, and he says a sort of good money might arise, and it might cause the people to better understand the inflation of their own local currencies. And then they might learn to demand a better currency. And the use of demand in that sense could be, could be out on the streets protesting, but it could be just that which the consumer uses, that would be sort of a type of demand. And that this demand will lessen the depreciation in quality. So over time, there might be just a tendency towards an order of better quality money. And that means that as everyone's going towards that better quality, then it would tend towards a ceiling of idealness. And idealness in this sense happens to be, well, it's what we were talking about, to be all on the same page. And then he says, as that starts to happen, it's possible that sort of leaders around the world can get together and mandate it as fiat. And so the idea is the population starts to understand it. They put pressure on their politicians, and then different leaders around the world, and this could be central bankers, could be leaders, it could be just certain people are leaders, right? It's like a sort of like a Neo-Bretton Woods situation where we get around and say, we've evolved, we have a new basis. But remember, he doesn't give a basis. And I found this word, it's called an enthemy. And this is a philosophical argument where the basis or the premise isn't stated. And I find ideal money to be an enthemy. My argument, and I wanted to say that this was Nash's argument, but it's not palatable for people. They can't accept it. So people seem to accept it better when I say my argument is that Bitcoin fits as a suitable basis for Nash's argument. And so we have that premise, and I think over time we might see, we haven't seen this yet, but a central banker, a research paper might come out and say, we realize that a Bitcoin standard could be better than a gold standard. It doesn't suffer those same problems. And at the same time, if the world were going to move off the US dollar as the reserve currency, it would free the US from the Triffin dilemma. And this reminds me of a lady named Helene Ray, I've seen her talks, and she has all the research data for all of the relations between countries, sort of in regard to their balance sheets. And she says there's a growing maturity problem. There's a growing problem. There's a discrepancy between the assets and liabilities, and it's showing the U.S. to be a world bank, which we all kind of know. And she says she says, I don't want to predict a run on the bank or a run on the U.S. as the world bank, but the stage is being set for it. So she's sort of a realist there. She doesn't want to step outside her data. But it's there. And a lot of people sort of predict that. Well, the U.S. sort of doesn't even want to be the issuer of the world reserve currency. They would rather have more control over their local economy. And this would be a consideration. It doesn't seem to make sense right now because you have Bitcoin in its early stages, and everyone's trying to push it as the global currency that everyone uses. But if you change that orientation, and that may be a very far away future, that may make sense. But right now, you can just we can move over to inflation targeting Bitcoin, and what that basically entails is central banks owning Bitcoin. It's a very easy, quick change in that sense.
Thanks for letting us record together to get all these ideas out to people in audio. You and I have talked quite a bit over the last year, but that doesn't mean I've heard all of your thoughts about Nash. And I would imagine that plenty of other people haven't yet either.
Yes, I think what is sort of the most difficult and the easiest to understand for people is the significance of the ICPI. That's sort of difficult, but it's easy to understand what he's saying. But then why he says the ultimate implementation of asymptotically ideal money, which is the sub-concept of how we would get to ideal money, came to him when he first conceived of the concept of the ICPI. And so that there's a leap of logic there. And that's where it gets difficult. Why is this important? How did you come up with that? And why would this be relevant to our future? And so if I come in and say, well, Bitcoin fits at that, it becomes fantastical, or it's like there's no way that these arguments speak to each other, but or the implementation of Bitcoin is spoken to by ideal money, but it does fit as a suitable basis. And then all of a sudden you have an interesting story about a man. At the end of Ideal Money, he starts to talk about how the Keynesians are comparable to the Bolsheviks or Bolshevik communism. And he, on a side note, he separates ideal Marxism or like theoretically ideal with the bad stuff that happened. And so it's really interesting in regard to his illness way back when he was saying the anti-communists and the communists are on the same team, and I'm going to be the one that saves the people. Because he notes that the Keynesian orientation, not necessarily Keynes, but how our global economy works today, is comparable to Bolshevik communism. And so he returns to this insight that seemed crazy, but then he puts a logical argument to it. And then he says there might be, based on a sort of political evolution, that people might learn to demand an ideal quality of money because of an alternative savings option that they have. So it's an orientation that's not, when you first come across Bitcoin, it's not something you would think of right away. But when you start to see it that way, a lot of the legwork that Nash has done starts to become relevant and significant. And so I really hope that some people who have a little more knowledge about economics and maybe some of the central banking researchers and research papers that come out can consider this view. And so I guess I'm just trying to get it out to enough people so that happens.
This completes our series on Nash. Thanks for listening.